It is a most peculiar phenomenon of our time that nations, accustomed to predictable patterns of engagement, have convinced themselves that stability is a product of rules rather than of will. They assume that diplomacy is a language spoken in whispers, a game played with cautious hands. This is an error. The world has never been governed by restraint alone. It has been governed by the perception of restraint, by men who understand that at times the greatest asset a statesman can wield is the suggestion that he may not be entirely rational. The doctrine of F around and find out is, in this regard, beautifully executed madness. The true genius of the FAFO Doctrine lies not in enforcement alone nor in retaliation, but in its ability to make the observer uncertain about the cost of provocation. Predictability is the oxygen of adversarial planning. By denying one's opponents a reliable frame of reference, by ensuring that the threshold for retaliation is neither fixed nor negotiable, one induces hesitation. And hesitation in matters of power is often indistinguishable from submission. During my tenure, I often advised that the appearance of unpredictability was as crucial as its reality. Nixon himself, with my enthusiastic encouragement, sought to convince the Soviet Union that he was liable to act irrationally under pressure. It was not that we intended chaos, but that we allowed our adversaries to believe we might. FAFO, in its purest form, understands this. It removes the burden of fixed red lines and replaces them with an amorphous, shifting fog of consequence. The most terrifying enemy is not the one who threatens war, but the one who makes you uncertain whether war has already begun. To the uninitiated, FAFO appears to be a doctrine of reckless escalation. This is a misreading. FAFO does not reject stability, it manufactures it through disorder. Conventional deterrence assumes an equation of force. A leads to B, which leads to C. The FAFO practitioner, however, disrupts this equation by ensuring that B is never entirely predictable. He conditions his opponents not to test boundaries, but to fear that the boundaries do not exist. This is a refinement, not a rejection of strategic deterrence. A leader who is willing to escalate at times and for reasons that seem unclear creates an equilibrium that is not based on mutual calculation but on anxiety. To be feared is useful. To be incomprehensible is divine. In foreign policy, a rational actor is one who maximizes his own power while minimizing risk. But what if one appears to abandon this rule? The madman hypothesis was not a gimmick. It was a realization that adversaries do not fear destruction alone. They fear the unpredictable hand that might, at any moment, turn the wheel too sharply. If one can cultivate a reputation for volatility, for actions that do not always correlate with expected outcomes, then one creates a battlefield in which only one's own rules apply. The FAFO Doctrine embodies this principle with a kind of brutalist simplicity. It does not merely deter, it unsettles. It forces adversaries to assume that the rational choice is to avoid provocation entirely, not because they know the response, but because they cannot afford to guess. This is power, stripped of its illusions. A sane man acting mad has greater freedom than a madman acting sane. But let us not be naive. The FAFO Doctrine is not without its perils. A strategy built upon calculated unpredictability must remain calculated. If one pushes too far, if one conditions the world to expect nothing but volatility, then one ceases to deter and begins to provoke. There is a fine line between a reputation for controlled madness and one for reckless abandon. History is littered with those who mistook sheer aggression for strategy, who believed that intimidation alone could secure their ambitions. Their error was not in wielding fear, but in mistaking it for an end rather than a means. To wield FAFO effectively, one must ensure that its escalation is always a choice, never an inevitability. If it ever becomes expected, then it ceases to be a deterrent and becomes an invitation to confrontation. And at that moment, FAFO risks becoming FUFO'd up, found out. To rule through fear, one must never become ruled by it. There will be those who recoil at FAFO, who claim that unpredictability is dangerous, that retaliation should be measured and rational. These are the same voices that decried the madman hypothesis, that feared Nixon's feints toward irrationality. But history shows that it was not the measured men who dictated terms. It was those who convinced the world that they might act beyond calculation. The FAFO Doctrine, if wielded correctly, is an exquisite instrument of control. It takes the oldest principle of power, fear, and sharpens it with ambiguity. It forces adversaries to spend their nights wondering whether this provocation will be tolerated or whether this misstep will bring the hammer down. It is, in short, the kind of doctrine that the living me would have deeply enjoyed crafting. So, to its practitioners, I offer my congratulations. The most effective way to control a game is to ensure the other players do not know the rules.